today I'm going to talk about a book I just recently read, which was OMG WTF Does the Constitution Actually Say? I buddy read this with Knox. I will leave Knox's channel linked down below. She's lovely, and I'm super happy that we buddy read this together because I actually got a lot out of it. I read it on an audiobook, and it is a pretty short audiobook but very engaging, and I learned a whole heck of a lot. So this just runs down the entire Constitution, and then the guy basically breaks down each part and says what's applicable still and what's not applicable. Just really, really interesting and very engaging. So he talks about different people who were involved in the making of what the United States was at its origin. And he actually said something, there were a few things that like I already knew about, like in order to be a Supreme Court justice, there is literally no prerequisite, like there's no, like anybody can be one, you don't have to be a lawyer. So he talks about a bunch of things that I had never heard about. Like one of them was Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to, I think it was James Madison, said, "Every constitution then and every law naturally expires at the end of 19 years. If it be enforced longer, it is an act of force and not of right." And I think that that is really interesting because, and conservatives are going to clutch their pearls at this, but there are people who believe that we should adhere very strictly to what the Constitution said, and I just don't get why. I think that we should revisit it every 19 years, like Thomas Jefferson said, because there is a lot of shit that just does not apply anymore. And there's so much that they like could not have foreseen to write about, like the internet. Like there's no amendments about the internet currently, and we live in a very internet fueled world. I mean, you're watching this on the internet. I'm making this because I have internet. Like the Constitution, the world, the country that they wrote it for, it doesn't really exist anymore. So shouldn't we revisit it? My dad would probably like have a heart attack if he heard me saying this. Another thing I learned was that we have the oldest constitution still in use, and that's like, maybe we should take a note from other countries. Another thing I learned was that George Washington thought that civics was our most important subject, and yet most schools don't require kids to learn civics. Like I didn't have a civics class in any of my studies, and it's actually kind of not surprising for my Christian school education that I had up till 8th grade, because they are very much about brainwashing you. So if they did have a civics class, it would be like very much like the Constitution is as good as the Bible. Yikes, fundamentalism. He talks about how he ran this book by constitutional experts, but because there are like disputes among constitutional experts, there really is not going to be like one translation currently of the Constitution that is like the translation, because it's disputed among experts, right? He talks about the 3/5 compromise, which I think I remember learning about in school, possibly, where black citizens were considered, as far as like the census goes, to be 3/5 of a person rather than a whole person, which is disgusting. But Native people, and I'd never heard this before, counted as 0, so they didn't even count as a person. So, and what the census does, he explained, is that it says how many representatives that you get. So depending on how many people are on the census, you get X amount of representatives. So they didn't want representation for black or Native people because racism. So isn't that just typical? But this was abolished by the 13th and 14th Amendments, so it doesn't apply anymore. Something that's not in the census that is currently done is that the census determines how much funding each state gets for things like schools and roads, which I think that that's really interesting, that they were like, you know what we need to prioritize? Not giving representation to Native and black people, but we need to prioritize making sure that there's enough funding for schools and roads depending on population size. Like what? Oh, priorities just out of whack. And then as the population grew, Congress enacted a cap on representatives to 400. He also talks about something I'd never heard of, which was that post roads used to exist, like specifically for the postal service, which is funny because I always think, man, shouldn't these big ass trucks that are always going so slow, shouldn't they have their own roads? But the postal service actually used to have that, and you would have to get special permission to use them. So that's interesting. He also talks about militia, which is pertinent to the Second Amendment, and again, conservatives are going to start clutching their pearls if they're watching this. It says the Militia Act of 1782 clarified that a militia is comprised of free, white, able-bodied males between 18 and 44. And then the Militia Act of 1862 expanded this to include men of all races. Then the Militia Act of 1902 established the U.S. military reserves as the main militia of the country. Then in 1936, women were allowed to serve in the reserves in a limited capacity. And it wasn't until 2016 that women could serve without limits. 2016, 4 years ago. I had my son that year. Ugh. So it's interesting that militia seems to be defined, and yet when we get to the Second Amendment, suddenly that just like goes out the window. He also talks about how the Eighth Amendment says that there can't be any excessive, cruel, and unusual punishment. Yet we have the cash bail system, which is unconstitutional. People are literally sitting in jail because they can't pay to get out, even though they haven't yet been convicted of a crime. And only the US and the Philippines in the entire world currently have a third-party cash bail system. And this third-party cash bail system makes billions of dollars every year. And keeping people awaiting trial, like just sitting in jail, costs taxpayers $15 billion every year. He also talks about how the death penalty should be considered cruel and unusual punishment, which makes sense because first of all, one study found that 11% of people on the death row end up being innocent, which that is, even 1 is too much, but 11%, good God, we're executing innocent people. And second of all, the death penalty has been proven to not deter crime. So what's the point? We have 4% of the world's population, yet we have the highest amount of incarcerated citizens per capita at 22%. What? And the 13th Amendment says that we can't have slaves, we can't be used for slave labor unless we've been convicted of a crime. Slavery by another name. Some prisoners don't get paid at all for the work they do and they're forced to work. And some prisoners get paid between $22 and like $1.10 an hour. That's slave labor. Also, there's a funny story I have to tell. So you know how treasonous pieces of shit decided to storm the Capitol because they decided to stage a coup over a fair and free election in which Joe Biden won? Yeah, so all of that furniture that they smashed and all of that shit that they broke, that has to be made by prisoners because the federal government has a contract and it says that they have to pay to buy furniture from Unicor, and Unicor gets all of its furniture made by prison labor, and they pay them like 50 cents an hour. So, isn't that great? Isn't that great? We also have prisoners fighting fires in California, so that's wild. We are just garbage. He also talks about how we should use the popular vote rather than the electoral college to choose the president, which that makes sense because land doesn't vote, people do. And he also talks about how it's like legally required for the states that the presidents like first go to. What is it for, like early voting or campaigning or something? They're always Iowa and New Hampshire, like by law, but we should switch it up because that generates a lot of money for those states' economies, and we should switch them up, like, and make it 2 different states every year. That way we could stimulate other states' economies, which that was a really interesting idea, something I had never heard of before. Interestingly enough, I didn't know what the 16th Amendment was, but it was about income tax, and that didn't start until 1913. We've only had income tax for a little over 100 years, which, that's interesting. The 18th Amendment made no more booze. And then it got repealed by the 21st. Which, actually, funny story, my great-grandfather owned a restaurant back in the days of Prohibition and got in big trouble for making moonshine in the back. I found the newspaper clippings, it was pretty funny. I mean, it probably wasn't funny when it happened, but it's funny now, like 100 years later. And interestingly, Walgreens, the pharmacy that's common here in the United States, there's one like right around the corner from me, Walgreens became such a huge business and made a huge amount of money during Prohibition because doctors were prescribing alcohol and people were illegally filling alcohol prescriptions at Walgreens, and that's how they got such a huge amount of business and became the thing that they are now. Another thing he brought up is presidential pardons, and I didn't know that President Ford pardoned Nixon, which the presidential pardon thing is such bullshit. Joe Arpaio should be in prison. He should be in prison. He should be in prison. In fact, a lot of people that Donald Trump pardoned should be in prison. Donald Trump should be in prison. I won't go there today. Another thing he talks about is taxation without representation, which want to talk about Puerto Rico? Want to talk about Puerto Rico? Also DC. DC residents pay a huge amount of taxes, and yet they don't actually have representation despite being the capital because they're not a state. The book encourages you to find out who your legislators are and write to them about issues that are important to you, specifically your state legislators. Who's your congressman? Like, do you know who those are? If you do, leave them down below. And that it really talks about right at the end how these are supposed to be people that are representing you and working for you, doing things that are important to you, that they are public servants. That is literally their job. And if they're not working for you, he encourages you to ask them to because that's what they should be doing. That is their job. And it's just as important to go out and make your voice heard by your local officials as it is to vote for president. And he said that Twitter is a really good place to have a conversation with your local politicians at like the state level because it's very public and they can't just say like, oh, I never got your email. You can continually tweet at somebody who represents you until they listen to you. So yeah, he makes some good like suggestions at the end about what you can do to get your voice heard and let your legislators know that you have an issue that you want them to deal with, which is how the system is supposed to work. So really an interesting book. I'm really glad I read it and I encourage you to. It's a like 4-hour audiobook and really easy to listen to. So highly recommend it. Thanks Knox for buddy reading with me. Leave your comments down below if you want to support my channel. You can do so by donating to my Ko-fi account. The link will be down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.